Morning, everybody. How we doing today? Uh, Throw grabbers was fun the other day. Hope y'all enjoyed that. Uh, it's a fun way to kind of have people grasp jazz and the meaning of it. You know, to catch that emotional current. I think it does change how we hear and perceive what they're talking about. And uh, as I've said many times, all people, all race and whatever age, can play the music. But when you look at it through that lens, it certainly informs us what different races or different age groups have to tell us. Different experiences, different environments, and of course, personality being the one thing that really sets people from the same group apart. But it's always a fun thing to do. I always enjoy doing the throat grabbers. Again, if you have an idea for a throat grabber, message me and send it to me, and I'll add it to my next throat grabbers in a few weeks when I do it. Appreciate you guys. Today I want to talk about 5 people behind the scenes in jazz that are really incredibly important and deserve a lot of recognition. And these 5 all get quite a lot of recognition, and there's a lot of names behind the scenes in jazz that are incredibly important. And you can make this list 30 people long, you know, if you start talking critics and engineers, and there's so many different facets. But these 5 are the 5 that I just really wanted to talk about today, because they were ambassadors not just for jazz but for the black community, and for the most part they were very instrumental and important in documenting a lot of important music, some more so than others. Number 5 on my list is Bob Weinstock, big Jewish fella who ran Prestige Records out of New York. And he wasn't like the others on this list where he was a racially open or sympathetic person. He was rather indifferent and at times cold-hearted, very business acumen driven. You know, it was very much about the dollars and the cents, and if it was black and it made sense and it made dollars, it made sense. But it wasn't this noble cause with Weinstock that you hear with some of the other people later on this list. He's more in the camp with the Chess brothers at Argo and Chess, and a guy like Herman Lubinsky at Savoy, that treated their blacks pretty awfully. I don't think Weinstock was as bad as Lubinsky or the Chess brothers. Certainly a lot of the black musicians stayed with Prestige for a long time, but he was still quite a dominating presence from what I've read and heard. But he still gave a lot of black musicians a lot of opportunity. And the Prestige label, for all of its flaws, which it does have, it's still an incredible documentation of the black bebop into hard bop, modern, into soul jazz movement. It dabbles some in the avant-garde a little, but not much. They never let it get too out, and most of what that was on new jazz, and even there it's still nothing compared to what was happening at some of the other labels around the country, especially New York. But Weinstock's still a very important figure, and he's one that deserves recognition, and people should know his name. The Prestige label stuck it out well into the 70s, and the body of work is so immense. And, you know, there's no question he was a bit of a charlatan snake oil salesman. He would repackage records and did all kinds of collections and compilations, and started second label prints and reissued the same music. You know, there was a lot of hustle in his game, but we can't criticize the hustler. You know what I mean? This whole system is set up on gaming, and just because you had some tricks up your sleeve and got good at the system, it's hard to fault you when you live in that system. And so money was obviously his driving motivation through most of this. There wasn't the burning ideology behind what most of the people on this list were about. And I left some pretty important names off this list, but I wanted to keep it kind of succinct and simple, because I do want to share something else at the end of this from my friend Jean-Michel. But so number 5 is Bob Weinstock, and he's definitely a giant of a man and a huge figure that we should recognize and be thankful for. Number 4 on this list is going to be the great Orrin Keepnews, and he with Bill Grauer was the driving force behind Riverside. And Riverside in 1958, 59, 60, 61, 62 is on par with Blue Note. It's surpassed Prestige at that point in terms of its body of work and its integrity and its the production of its sessions. Most things at Prestige feel very loose, very unorganized, very unplanned. A lot of it feels that way, which leads to some actually great loose blues driven sessions at Prestige. But the polish and the refinement that Blue Note and Riverside had in that era is pretty far superior. Cannonball Adderley was allowed to produce and bring people into the label, and he brings in some just great young talent and some old talent as well. Keepnews was a great ear, was instrumental in assigning a lot of the artists that Riverside signed. His relationship with Monk was very important. And Riverside, of course, was partnered with Bill Grauer, and Bill Grauer was kind of the business side of things, and Keepnews was more of the music side of things. And Grauer wasn't a bookkeeper, and at least he wasn't what was advertised, because Riverside made a lot of bad business decisions. It sounds like they didn't really manage money or even make allowances for upcoming expenses, and they were quite quickly in trouble financially. And whether it was the stress of it or just whatever, Bill Grauer ends up dying in 63 and leaving the label to Keepnews. And it was in such financial trouble that they eventually filed bankruptcy pretty quickly. And a few titles still come out on the Riverside label after that. I think it might have been Fantasy that grabbed it up right away. Someone grabs it up, and they put a few more titles out in the 400 series and the Jazzland series after the sale and the foreclosure. But the legacy of Riverside from probably mid 57 through 62, it's as great as Blue Note at that time, and almost as black. It's a very black affair, and they certainly document a lot of the most important jazz. And then Keepnews, of course, stays in the jazz scene well into the 80s and 90s. I believe Milestone was a label he was a big part of. I think there was another label he was a big part of as well. I meant to look it up. It's on the tip of my tongue. I can't remember what it is. But Keepnews stays definitely a big part. And I think Orrin Keepnews was a Jew as well. I'm not positive on that. But my memory is jostling right now with that information. I think I looked it up before and he was a Jew, but I'm not positive. It doesn't really matter, except for the fact that the Jews were incredible ambassadors for this music. And that their struggle and what was happening in Europe, it made them all very sympathetic and comprehending what was happening in Black America. And so the Jews played a very instrumental role. And the Chess Brothers were Jewish. Herman Lubinsky was Jewish. So it by no means meant that they were going to be empathetic and soft-handed. That was more the exception than the rule, being soft-handed. Like, there was what Alfred Lion does at Blue Note. That's not the average. That's the exception. And speaking of Alfred Lion and Frank Wolf, they share number 3 on this list. The legacy of Blue Note, we've spoken about it many times, but Alfred Lion and Frank Wolf deserve so much credit. A guy like Hank Mobley has very little video footage out there of him, but Francis Wolf documented him in photograph endlessly, and it's true for almost all the Blue Note cats, especially from the late 50s and the early 60s. Frank Wolf has taken all kinds of photographs in the studio, out and about around town. Someone mentioned this to me a while back, and it's true. Horace Silver is one of the only cats that you don't really see him in the studio playing as much. You see him out around town, in front of hotels and in front of parks, and I don't know how he got that part of his contract or what was the deal with that, but Horace Silver has some cool photographs. The the Blue Note stable is such a giant label of artists now in our perception, but at that time they were all really pretty unknown, which is kind of the shocking thing to us. As you delve deeper into it, there wasn't a lot of recognizable names, in part because Blue Note couldn't pay recognizable names. That wasn't their domain, that they didn't have that kind of liquidity, so they were getting the young up and coming talent. They were quick to rob Savoy. Lee Morgan and Hank Mobley, Donald Byrd, all those guys were at Savoy first, and they were quickly convinced to come to Blue Note. And a lot of them, most of those guys, all spent years at Blue Note. And Savoy, Prestige, and Blue Note all recorded with Reed Van Gelder in New Jersey, and so it wouldn't be that difficult to go to a session at Van Gelder's place and hear some bass player or drummer talking about Blue Note, how much better they're treated there, and how much it was more of a supportive environment for the black musician. And so it wasn't like they had to get in the rumor mill and put their ear to the ground. They were intermingling at that studio, all three labels, and all those musicians were recording for all three labels. And Savoy definitely seems to be more of a place where you started. You didn't gravitate or graduate to Savoy. You started there and got out of there as quickly as you could, it seems like. Not a lot of the greats stayed there very long, especially in the 50s. It seems to be very much... again, the Savoy golden era is in the 40s, after the war. And that's important to kind of comprehend that by the 1950s, by the LP era, Savoy's kind of... I don't want to say diminished, because they're certainly doing some great stuff still. And they're certainly still discovering some great artists. Cannibal Adderley's early work, Nat Adderley's early work. It's a pretty impressive Kenny Clark's work with Milt Jackson. There's a lot of important stuff happening at Savoy. But, again, the Blue Note legacy is just so ironclad. I don't need to delve too deep into what's happening there, because you're all pretty familiar with it if you've watched this channel for any length of time. The Blue Note legacy and Alfred Lyon's treatment of the blacks, how much he validates what they're doing, what they're trying to accomplish, what it means. He seems to get all of that in spades. He seems to get all of that. And he, pays for her rehearsal time, which was unheard of at a small label, which again leads to a group empathy, a group coherence. This song might not have nothing to do with what's happening in the news today, but if we sit outside and have a smoke break and for 45 minutes we talk about what's happening in the news today, there's no way, as people who emote immediately into our horns how we feel, that we're not going to be reflecting some of that back into our horns and expressing some of that headline. And that could be positive or negative, in terms of what's happening in the news, the world around you. You can reflect both the joy and the pain and the sorrow. And boy, that's what Blue Note really does well. It talks about the tension of the 50s and the 60s, and if you can't feel the vitality and the urgency of those late 50s Blue Note recordings, you're listening from the wrong place. It's a very urgent message being delivered. And so we'll move on from Blue Note. No one was shocked to hear that was on the list. Number 2 on the list is, of course, Creed Taylor. And I don't get the feel from Creed Taylor that race was too much of what was driving him. You don't hear a lot of discussions about him in racial context, whether it being pro or negative. Creed Taylor seemed very much interested in Creed Taylor. That seemed to be his driving engine, his force. And I've discussed Creed Taylor quite a lot, probably more so early last year than I did in the last 5 months or so. But Creed Taylor was a kind of a self-professed producer. He didn't really have musical chops. He didn't really have the training to be an engineer or a producer. He just said that's what he was, and oddly enough, he got hired to do that. And he goes into Bethlehem early on and convinces Gus Wilde that jazz was what we needed to do here in 1952-53, and stop trying to make little pop throw-off hits because you're not going to be successful. Jazz was the key. And they have some success early on with Chris Connor, and then, of course, Nina Simone comes a little bit later. And then they bring in all these great musicians into Bethlehem, from Johnny Hartman to Oscar Pettiford to the great West Coast kids that all are playing and recording at Bethlehem. Most of those great Stan Kenton guys, who also often played in Howard Rumsey's Lighthouse All-Stars, almost all those cats make records at Bethlehem as leaders. Whether you're talking Stan Levy, whether you're talking Frank Rosalino, Claude Williamson, those guys all got a chance and those records are so awesome. You know, it's some of the best modern white jazz you'll ever hear. And it's played with a lot of intensity, a lot of up-tempo, bright, expressive. The only thing that makes it cool, because it's not really cool. Dave Brubeck's cool. Chico Hamilton's cool. These cats weren't really cool, but they were still labeled cool. And it's because that white condition, that white experience isn't as intense. It's not emoting the same degree of desperation. So even the casual listener can listen to those records and it's cool. Whereas an Angry Black record from Lee Morgan from the same time frame on Blue Note, on some levels they don't sound that different, but emotionally the context is dramatically different. And I think that's why some of that West Coast cool gets mislabeled as being cool when it's really not. It's really hard driven, up-tempo, bright, modern, postmodern. I don't even want to call it hard bop because I think the emotional conditioning of hard bop is an important element of what makes hard bop hard bop. You got to be kind of an angry young black man to play it. You know, it's a bit like certain parts of gangster rap. It's hard for a white cat to come along and pull that off with any legitimacy. But we're listening to a fun little record here. This is a rare Savoy piece, number 100, 12,100. It's I just love jazz piano. It's got some Hampton Hawes, some John Mehegan, some Herbie Nichols, and some Paul Smith, all of who were important players. Paul Smith, of course, has a record as a leader at Savoy, but he ends up working with Ella Fitzgerald along with Stan Levy. Herbie Nichols, of course, is a great New York-based friend of Bud Powell's and Monk's and Powell's stuff. Nichols' stuff on Blue Note and on Bethlehem is really fantastic. Mehegan's a Savoy guy who I don't know too much about, but he's a great little player. Then, of course, Hamp Hawes is an institution on the West Coast and was part of the Lighthouse All-Stars as well, and that whole Stan Kenton scene with all those great players that were white. So it's a fun little record. Number 100. So it's going to be the last one of that 100 that I want to show you. Like I said, I had an update on that tracking. It should be on its way here from Pittsburgh. Hopefully by midweek I'll get it. But gnawing on my teeth waiting for this shit to show up. I probably bought 7 packages that week. All the other ones have been here for a while now. And the one I bought just for that episode, of course, was the one that doesn't show up. But what could you do? You know, we're surviving, we're living. We're blessed to be here. We're blessed to be informed by jazz how to survive tough times. And jazz will give you a lift. Jazz will perk your spirits up. So anyway, Creed Taylor, he's at Bethlehem. He's instrumental in a lot of the early Bethlehem sounds. I believe that Betty Roche record where she's doing A-Train. I think he's there probably into 56, if I recall. Which means he does a lot of the BCP series and most of a lot of the 10-inch series Creed Taylor's a part of. He wasn't the lone name voice in there, which is partly why he moves on. But Creed Taylor was definitely a guy on a mission. He had an idea what jazz could sound like, how he could package it and present it to take a lot of the rough edges off of it and make it palatable to John and Paul Smith and their daughter Clementia as they live in the the Eden Vale with their station wagon and their track housing. We can listen to this music because it's very soothing with its gatefold artwork, and that was the vision Creed Taylor had. Bethlehem was short-lived, and he moves on before the label sells, but he moves over to ABC, which was a film company that was doing some pretty good jazz in 57 and 58, and he's instrumental in convincing ABC, which was from its creation in 55 to the time 58 rolls around, had quickly become a fairly major, well-distributed label. Pretty quickly. The power of a film soundtrack industry can do that to you. The money that's there and distribution, money and distribution of white Hollywood entrepreneurs is a far different thing than a couple Jewish kids in New York recording Blue Note, you know. So ABC ascends quickly. He convinces them to launch Impulse and helps them sign John Coltrane. And he launches the gatefold record era. Like, there's not really gatefolds pre Creed Taylor and Impulse. It's kind of a very new concept, and the lovely way the covers and artwork are presented, the great in-depth liner notes, the hallmark spines that you can recognize in any stack of records. It's really well done, and those record jackets amazingly stand the test of time. I've stumbled on many Impulse records over the years in the wild where the jackets still looked immaculate. And oftentimes, depending on what the record was, the record usually did pretty well too. But I found records that were beat up and the jacket was still pristine. So those records, that heavy cardboard stock, the shellac on the cover, what's the word I'm looking for, laminate, they're just really nicely presented jackets. And that was part of what Creed Taylor wanted to do. Was he wanted to make it art, like very commercialized art that was accessible. And of course, Coltrane wasn't going to be put in that box. Coltrane wasn't just going to sit back and do My Favorite Things renditions over and over again for you. That wasn't Coltrane's path. And I think I've read some of the books on Impulse. I don't know if they clash necessarily, but he certainly wasn't going to be managed by Creed Taylor. And I think Creed Taylor saw that he needed to move on, and Bob Thiele comes in. And so Creed Taylor moves on to Verve. And his legacy at Verve is also very incredible. He does dismiss a lot of the old cats at Verve and launches a whole new sound at Verve, a very polished commercial sound. He brings a lot of the big names into Verve, especially the white players, your Bill Evans, your Cal Jaders, your Kai Windings. But he also brings in some of the brothers like Jimmy Smith, Wes Montgomery. Very dramatic shift in the direction of Verve Records in 61, 62 when Creed Taylor comes over. And of course, Verve goes to the gatefold as well. The lovely laminate covers, the great artwork. Some of those Verve covers are just gorgeous. And then Creed Taylor is there for the bulk of the 60s. Then he moves on to A&M and then launches CTI at A&M before he eventually takes CTI out on his own. And in the 70s, CTI is one of the big forces in jazz. It certainly doesn't have the emotional textures and context of what was happening in the 50s and 60s. A, those times have changed. B, that message is being delivered in soul music, not in jazz anymore. But he still makes some very commercialized products that sold well, kept jazz in people's ears. It helped keep a live jazz circuit going. A lot of those guys recorded for CTI quite a lot. And there's a pretty wide spectrum from Hubert Laws to George Benson to Freddie Hubbard, you know, how CTI records sound. But the legacy of Creed Taylor, when you're involved with all those great labels and are kind of a forebearer of a lot of things, from gatefolds to the polished production, Creed Taylor sessions, especially by Impulse, Verve, and CTI, there's definitely a production sense to a session. You know, when Cal Jader does Breeze from the East, it's not going to be one song with kind of an Eastern feel and then the rest disconnected. It's going to be a session where the instruments, the backing musicians, the entire production is going to have a vibe to it, a feel to it. And Creed Taylor was great at innovating a lot of that stuff and making albums feel cohesive, which that's not a real common thread in the early LP era. A lot of LPs are a culmination of numerous different sessions, sometimes different backing musicians. Even in rock and roll in the early days, the LP wasn't produced as a unit. It's what Sgt. Pepper's comes along, where an album takes on a new definition and meaning. Oh, wow, this whole thing is kind of a cohesive piece of work. And you definitely get that with a lot of Creed Taylor's efforts and production values. So I think he's a very important guy, and he kept jazz commercialized and selling long after the bulk of the market had shifted away from jazz. So we gotta give Creed Taylor recognition. And number one on this list, and he's probably number one by a mile, is N.GRANZ. And N.GRANZ is such an important figure. And he's such an underappreciated figure in jazz, as is the Verve label. Verve, prior to Creed Taylor, was N.GRANZ's child. And he takes his early recordings at Clef and N.GRANZ and relaunches it all with Verve, in part because of Ella Fitzgerald. He gives Ella her own sequence, the 4000 sequence. He reissues a lot of his old Clef stuff and N.GRANZ stuff on early Verve numbers, 8000 numbers. Early on in the Clef's history, he was licensing a lot of that stuff to Mercury to print and put out, which how he retained ownership of that stuff to reissue it himself on Verve, I'm not really sure. I've asked my friend Jean-Michel, and he wasn't even sure how that business side worked out. But he was an ambassador for the black musician. He took these people on the road and treated them like royalty. He refused for anybody else to treat them any differently. He saw them as ambassadors of American goodwill. And in spite of most people around the world knowing that, he was defiant in letting Americans know this stuff, it matters. It's important. The Jazz at the Philharmonic was an incredibly important institution. He gave a lot of these old jazz players from the swing era a lot of work and paid them well. And one of the reasons why you don't see a lot of the older cats showing up at places like Blue Note is because Blue Note could never pay them what N.GRANZ was making sure they got paid at Verve. And it's such an important thing to... And Blue Note couldn't have paid them any better than they did. Blue Note was scraping by, you know. But Verve and N.GRANZ document so much important jazz during this golden era of the small group combo, the end of the swing era and the big groups. The war changes everything. Bebop comes along, and Bebop takes a lot of the greatest talents from that swing era, and most of them can't wait to jump into this new modern sound. And there's a lot of really great talent that N.GRANZ gives a lot of work to, a lot of recording to, from Dizzy Gillespie to Bud Powell, from Harry Edison to... It's just such a long list. It really, really is. And if you scroll through the Verve discography from 8,000 up into 8,400 or so, it's a who's who of the greats of that era, you know. And most of them were in their 50s and 60s by this time. Verve doesn't have a lot of the young guys. It's mostly the older cats, and he made sure they were treated properly and taken care of. He helped them manage their money. He helped make sure they weren't taken for advantage of by landlords, and he was loved by his musicians. And my friend Jean-Michel could tell you more about this because he knew Ella and Count Basie and Ray Brown and Ella Fitzgerald. He knows all those people really well. He grew up, and that was his family as he grew up, and he helped produce and set up a lot of great concerts in tours in Europe. And a lot of those cats felt very comfortable in Europe and were really well received in Europe. But the love they all had for N.GRANZ and the appreciation for how he treated them, it seems to be fairly universal in all the feedback and all the documentation. He was just a real, genuine love light, and it was like he felt honored to be of service to them, which is a very different way to treat the black male in America, the black female in America. I just got done watching the Ma Rainey Black Bottom, which was a remake of a play done in the 80s. Denzel Washington produced it. It was recommended by one of my channel subscribers, and we enjoyed it. Me and the family watched it. It's charged. There's a lot of being a theatrical production. It's dialogue driven. But they picked great actors, including Mr. Potts. What's his first name? The guy who played Brother Muzan in The Wire. There's some really great actors in there, and they deliver that dialogue very well. The guy who was in Black Panther that passed away recently, whose name I can't think of right now, he plays one of the lead characters. And you see the sorrow, anger, fear, tension the blacks live in, how Ma Rainey has to be almost a bitch just to even get any respect. And they're in the North in Chicago trying to record these sessions, and you just see what it's like being black, walking into a white cafe trying to get a Coca-Cola from Ma Rainey. The story that Levy talks about his mom being raped by some whites, and his dad, how he handled it, and how a black man has to find revenge and justice in this world, and how sometimes black on black violence is a result of black frustration against the power structure that they can't budge. And it spills out emotionally against people that it was never intended to spill out against. But the sorrow, the pain, the terror is so real. And the time that these sessions were being recorded, it's really, it was nicely done. It's nicely done. It's obviously a film that was coming from the stage, because like I said, it's very dialogue driven. But it was really well done. The costumes were great. The cars, all the stuff was pretty well presented. And it certainly gives you some insight into how blacks worked with the whites, and how most of the successful black musicians had a white guy in their corner, a N.GRANZ, an Alfred Lion. It's just incredible. So anyway, those are the 5 most important back behind the scene people from this era of jazz in my mind. And earlier eras have different figures, and the later eras, of course, are going to have different figures. But Keepnews, Alfred Lion, C.TAYLOR, B.WEINSTOCK, and N.GRANZ, those 5 people are all very instrumental. And the jazz landscape of that time frame wouldn't look anything like it does without them. So enjoy those 5 giants of the music, and the music that they help produce and preserve for posterity. They're all such important pieces of the puzzle, and their names should all be pretty fluent in our minds. We should know well who they are. I want to do a more in-depth thing on N.GRANZ at some point, but I need my friend John Michel needs to be part of that. He's much more, he has a lot of first-hand stories. He sat on Count Basie's knee, on Duke Ellington's knee, so he could tell a lot of things, and I want to start featuring him more on the channel. As a matter of fact, I'm going to try to put a little thing he sent me at the end of this episode today, so you can dig into some Jean Michel and some of his stories. He's from Switzerland, so the accent takes a little getting used to, but I had no problem understanding him, so hopefully none of you will as well. I did feature him some on my Patreon jazz journals that hardly anybody watched. So I'm gonna try putting him on here once in a while. Actually start doing interviews with him live. I just haven't set it up. I got so much crazy stuff going on, and I'm not the most technically savvy guy. A lot of this stuff's a bit challenging to me. I've gotten the YouTube thing somewhat figured out, I think, but when I watch on the YouTube, I'm like, okay, I'm certainly not doing a lot of the things a lot of people do, in terms of advertising and the cards and a lot of the. I'm just putting out my words. That's all I'm really kind of doing. So y'all be safe. You have a great day. Be blessed. We'll talk to y'all soon. I'm hoping to get the mail this week, and we've got some fun stuff coming. Jazz on, guys. Peace.